Hey there. You guys might know me as that weirdo who makes videos on characters in games based on historical or mythical figures, then compares them to their original, particularly for the game Fate Grand Order. More generally, I have a tendency to blend both video games and being a massive history nerd. But how did this happen? How did I become such a history nerd? And why, as a history nerd, do I give so much attention to video games? Well, it's time to tell a story. The year is 2000, December of 2000. I was much smaller then, and I am off with my parents to Fry's Electronics. Why? Because it's my birthday. I know, I'm one of those lucky kids who has their birthday in the same month as Christmas. Anyway, it's my birthday, which means I get to pick out a gift. Yay! So, what am I looking at? Well, I'm really into video games, both the PlayStation 1 and the PC. But since I didn't have very much money, I could only get so many games. That meant that, by default, I tended to gravitate towards games with lots of replayability. In other words, RPGs, sports, which I could play with my dad, and strategy. And today, in December 2000, there are two games I am looking at, and both of them are strategy games. One is a sequel to a game I'd already played, while the other is something completely new, but something I'd heard was really good. The first game was Command & Conquer: Red Alert 2. Again, I'd played both the original Command & Conquer as well as the first Red Alert. The second game was Age of Empires 2: The Age of Kings, together with its expansion pack, The Conquerors. Remember expansion packs? They're the precursors to DLC, back before we had fast internet, and so before downloading entire games was feasible. That's why I'm in a store, after all. In December 2000, you had to buy physical copies of games. Steam didn't exist yet. Anyway, so I'm looking at these two games, Red Alert 2 and Age of Empires 2. I can get either one of them, but I can only choose one of them. The sequel to a game series I already knew, for better or worse, or something new and exciting, but unproven. I stood in the store with my parents for some time, debating the merits of each of these games. After some time passed, I finally came to a decision. I chose Red Alert 2, which has felt like a mark of shame ever since. Not because it was a bad game, but because it ultimately proved to be just okay. Also, one of its features was that you could blow up lots of famous landmarks, like the Statue of Liberty or the Pentagon, which became a bit less appealing after a certain event 9 months later. I couldn't play the game after that. Anyway, so Red Alert 2 won, and Age of Empires 2 lost. But only for the moment. 6 months later, in June 2001, I would be back. I had a deal with my parents that if I got good grades, I'd get some money. I'd just finished 6th grade, so I had some money. We went back to the store and I got myself not just Age of Empires 2 and its expansion, but a box set that also included Age of Empires 1 and its expansion. But my experience with this game was different from the usual games I played. Instead of the story being about fictional conflicts that never happened, these were real stories. Real events that were being retold through the game. Instead of marching to war with the Soviets or the Orcish Horde, I was doing so with Jeanne d'Arc, Attila the Hun, Saladin, and many others. And by doing so, something happened. I became curious. The games themselves told their stories pretty well, but I couldn't help but wonder, what about other stories? What about people mentioned in the game, but who don't get their own focus? And how did we go from things like the Battle of Tours to the Reconquista, the Crusades, and the fall of Constantinople? The next time I went out to visit a store, it wasn't to buy a game, it was to buy a book on medieval history. I didn't know it then, but I had just started a chain of events that would completely change my life. Because it turned out that Age of Empires 2 was only the beginning. I began to notice other games set during historical periods, games that I would play, and then decide to follow up on by getting my hands on more books. I didn't play Age of Empires 1 as much as its sequel, but it did help open the door to the ancient world. A new series of games where I'd hack through hundreds of enemies on battlefields in ancient China. Before long, I had my own copy of Three Kingdoms. A new game where you led samurai armies onto battlefields as part of a larger civil war. Oh yeah, I remember that Hideyoshi guy from those 2 battles in Age of Empires. A new shooter game set in a much more recent conflict. one which I knew my great-grandparents had fought in? Well, that certainly opened a massive box. So too did the games released by a new game studio called Paradox, which allowed me to not only explore new historical periods, but to reenact them in the games. Each new game set during a historical period opened a door for me, and I was all too eager to walk through it. In a very short span of time, it seemed like everything changed. Prior to this point, I didn't have the best time in school. I was weak in many subjects, particularly math, something that my classmates loved to remind me of. And because I was part of a special program that put all the high-achieving students in the same class year after year, I basically looked like the stupid kid who wasn't good at anything in a class full of geniuses. My test scores had gotten me into this program, but I felt seriously out of my league. When I was doing algebra in middle school, I had friends who were doing trigonometry, and one of them was actually in calculus. Biology, chemistry, physics? No way, especially since science classes tended to get increasingly mathy. English? Well, I could hold my own there. My mom, being a college professor who taught English, kinda made sure that if there was one thing I would learn how to do, it would be writing. So that was something. But my peers didn't read the essays I turned in. All they saw was when I screwed up at most everything else. All of these experiences did horrible things to my self-esteem. I wasn't even that bad of a student. I was just made to feel like one because my talents were hidden, while my failings were on public display. School was like torture, and it led me to neglecting my studies because even doing homework reminded me of a place I desperately wanted to escape from. And, in looking for that escape in video games, it turned out that I had stumbled across what would end up turning all of this around. As time went on, all of those miserable experiences I had in school, of people having laughs about how bad I was at things, all of that stopped. Because while I still wasn't very good at many different subjects, when it was time to go to history class, it was a very different story. Classmates used to joke about my terrible scores on math homework. Now, it was the history teacher telling jokes about how he might just take the afternoon off and let me teach the class instead, because I probably could. What had once been a nightmare had become much more tolerable, because even if I was bad at lots of things, there was at last something that I was good at, something that I could be proud of. I had found my interest, my specialty, and I had found it because I played video games. Because I got curious about the settings of the games I was playing, and that led me to a completely different world. It's not what I expected when I first started to play games like Age of Empires 2, Dynasty Warriors, or Hearts of Iron, but it is where I ended up. So there it is. That's the story of how video games made me a massive history nerd, and why I am so comfortable doing both of those things at the same time. Someone who spends half their time conquering the world in games, and the other half reading all sorts of history things might seem strange at first. But for me, those two things go together, and they helped make me the person I am today, a huge nerd.